Hello everyone and welcome to our seminar, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Cristina Lessenbandeira and I'm chair of IPEN, the International Parliament Engagement Network, which co-hosts with the IPU, the Inter-Parliamentary Union, the Public Engagement Hub, and within which we're doing the seminar. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the seminar on public engagement with parliamentary work on climate change, a really, really important topic. And this seminar is part of a series of seminars we're organising following the publication in 2022 of our global parliamentary report on public engagement done by the IPU and UNDP, but also as part of the IPU's programme of activities on climate change, a very important theme. Now, before introducing today's topic and our speakers, can I just ask a few housekeeping rules? So the seminar has translation available in French and in Spanish, and one of the presentations will be done in Spanish. So can you please choose the language you'd like to hear the seminar in, which you should be able to do by going to the bottom of your screen, and you'll see a symbol of a globe, and in there just choose English, French or Spanish, and you'll hear the whole seminar in that language. And so the seminar is overall about an hour and a half. Throughout that time, can you please keep your mics muted? If you want to keep your cameras on, that's absolutely fine. It's nice to see faces. So if your broadband, if your internet connection allows you to do that, you're very welcome to do so. But the mics, if they're kept muted, then that makes it all much easier. And I'll explain a little bit about the structure and the opportunities to ask questions in a minute. But just to introduce the topic then. So the seminar will mainly focus on two case studies that the IPU has just published through its public engagement LinkedIn page. And those two case studies explore how parliamentary public engagement on climate change policies have been developed or could be developed into specific cases. So one of the case studies is by the Parliament of South Africa, and the other one focuses on the Escazú Agreement in Latin America. And in the context of post-COP28, where a number of historical agreements have been reached, it's obviously particularly important at this point to discuss how those decisions at very high level, international, transnational level, are then translated into national policies, but as important, how parliaments engage the public and ensure public participation in drafting those policies, which will then transfer, operationalize those international agreements. And that's what our case studies try to do. And so we have a fantastic set of speakers to talk about these case studies and to answer your questions. So on the South African case study, we have Nhlanhla Ginindza, who is a researcher at the National Assembly Portfolio Committee on Forestry, Fisheries and Environment from the Parliament of South Africa. And then we'll have Temitayo Odeyemi from the University of Leeds at the UK, and Omomayowa Abati from the Stellenbosch University in South Africa. And they're the authors of the IPU case study on the Parliament of South Africa Climate Change Bill. And the IPU case study is entitled Taking Parliament to the People, Parliamentary Committee and Community Engagement on the Climate Change Bill in South Africa. And I'm sure that at some point Andy will put the links to the actual case studies in the chat, so you can have a look at it yourself at some point. And then after that, we'll hear about the Escazú Agreement, and that will be by Pablo García Baccino, who's the director of Latin America policy analysis at the Directorio Legislativo, based in Buenos Aires. And he authored the IPU case study on the Escazú Agreement, citizen participation in environmental matters and the role of the legislative branch. And you now have both case studies published in the chat if you want to have a look at them in a minute as you hear our speakers. So the order of the seminar will be as follows. We'll first have a short video which will summarize some of the agreements and some of the challenges that the parliamentary committee, the parliamentary group addressed at COP28. And then we will hear about the South African case study. where we'll have 3 speakers, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions to our speakers, and then we'll move on to the case study in Latin America, and there'll be a new opportunity for questions to our speakers. So I hope that's all clear enough. Everyone knows where they are and what we're going to do. And so before we start our focus on the South African case study, we're going to listen to a short video, which, as I said earlier, tries to summarize what happened at COP28. So we'll hear from Mrs. Meera Al-Suwaidi, who's a member of the Federal National Council of the United Arab Emirates, and who was rapporteur for the Parliamentary Committee at COP28. So it gives you a really nice context for what we're going to be discussing after, which is how national parliaments then can actually try to implement these policies. So Andy, over to you when you're ready to share the video for us to listen to.
Esteemed parliamentarians, dear colleagues, it is my pleasure to address you today. My name is Meera Al-Suwaidi, and I'm a member of parliament from the United Arab Emirates Federal National Council. Also, I was rapporteur to the parliamentary meeting during COP28. Against the backdrop of our parliamentary meeting, it is essential to recognize the broader context of COP28, which concluded with the UAE consensus, an agreement that was remarkable, historical, made amongst 198 nations, setting an ambitious climate agenda for the world. This historical agreement emphasizes transitioning away from fossil fuels to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, urging comprehensive nationally determined contributions, and establishing energy efficiency targets by 2030. Beyond the formal negotiations of COP28, there were other significant achievements, such as Altera, a $30 billion finance vehicle, and declarations on sustainable agriculture, food systems, and health. This comprehensive effort mobilized over $85 billion in funding and garnered support for 11 pledges. COP28 made significant progress in operationalizing loss and damage, adaptation finance, and youth inclusion. I would also like to highlight the significant unveiling of the COP28 UAE Declaration on Climate and Health. This collaboration with the World Health Organization emphasizes integrating health into climate action, aiming for resilient and sustainable health systems backed by substantial financial commitments. Now, focusing on the outcomes of our parliamentary meeting. Our role as parliamentarians is clear: to encourage our governments to implement the outcomes of this global stocktake. This means rolling up our sleeves with a laser focus on green initiatives and sustainable practices. Some of the key themes that we covered during our meeting and that were included in the outcome document are as follows. International collaboration as a bridge to success. We must partner with our governments to cooperate on technology transfer, capacity building, and knowledge sharing, fostering bonds, particularly between developed and developing nations. We are stewards of public resources. Therefore, our oversight and budgeting responsibilities are crucial to ensure that national climate policies align with international commitments, as well as ensuring that we encourage and look for innovative financing mechanisms and integrate green budgeting processes. Another key theme is inclusivity. Inclusivity and equity are our guiding principles. Our climate strategies should reflect the diverse needs of our populations, with a special emphasis on the leadership roles of women and youth, and looking at vulnerable communities, especially small island states. Public participation is not just a checkbox, it is the heart of our efforts. We must engage our constituents in climate action, supporting education, raising awareness about sustainable lifestyles is one of our key responsibilities. And us as MPs, we must lead by example. Small positive steps will lead to collective sustainable change. To conclude, Climate action is not just a political statement. It is a call to action that demands our dedication and commitment. Together, let us carry the spirit of COP28 into shaping a more sustainable and resilient future for our nations, our children, and generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. So that gave us a really good context of what we're talking about in here following COP28, and that call for action that a member referred to at the end is very much about what we're going to talk about in terms of how parliaments can involve the publics in discussing policies on climate change. So if I could invite now Mr. Ginindza to have a short Q&A with me to get a bit of an update on what's happening in the Parliament of South Africa, and then we'll hear more in detail about actually how you involved the public in the consideration of the climate change bill. But before we do that, can you just give us a quick update on the status of the climate change bill? I understand that it was adopted by the National Assembly in October 2023. Do you have more updates on that?
Yes, thank you, Christina. The bill, as you may be aware, that Parliament has two houses. It has to be processed in both houses. So one house, the National Assembly, has already processed it and it was overwhelmingly adopted. And the House, which marked the beginning of the referral process to the other House of Parliament, the National Council of Provinces. They have already started with the processes, which includes the first stages, which is receiving briefings before they go to their provinces to receive mandates, as well as further input. And because I understand that during the consultations by the National Assembly, others realized after some time that maybe we're supposed to say this clause should read like that. So they will have a second bite, if we may call it that, in that process. So that is where it currently is. And we are hopeful that the process will be wrapped up before Parliament rises, because by April, May, we should be having elections, which will mark the end of the current parliamentary term. So there's also that in terms of the time crunch to be considered.
So the time is very tight. And so how long will you have dedicated for going back to the provinces? Will you have about 2 weeks, about a month? Do you know now at this point?
The process is regulated by the parliamentary rules. So it's prescribed there that there should be a minimum of 6 weeks, because that is considered to be adequate in terms of getting mandate. So it's possible that in other provinces, the time might be slightly shorter, others might be slightly longer, because there's also other pieces of legislation that are being processed at the same time. And all of them, you find that they are all equally important. So we expect that it will not take that long, because the implications should it not be finalized before the end of the term, because it will lapse. Then some of the other phase will need to be restarted. So that will take into maybe each about 3 or 4 months. So it's one of the bills that are prioritized for processing and conclusion.
And why would you say was it important to have this public participation in the preparation for the climate change bill? Why was it so important to do so?
The parliamentary process is guided by constitutional provisions. The Constitution requires that anything that has to do with the public, there should be input from the public. And there was also a court judgment that added a key factor there, that it's a meaningful consultation. The meaningfulness is what then tends to make the whole process to be elaborate also in terms of resources and time, because now we had to develop rules that we felt fit this new term of meaningful. So one of them, it's capacity building, so that when we go to communities, communities are already workshopped. They are not shocked or hearing or seeing the bill for the first time. So there's that as part of the preparatory process. Then after they have been workshopped, they go to their constituencies down to the street level, where the people live, to raise the awareness and also to alert them that Parliament will be coming at a certain date to hear your input on these proposed legislation, and these are the clauses, and these are the intentions of the bill. So when that process unfolds, there's already generally a parallel process from us, which would be informed by, maybe let me reverse a bit. It has to be advertised nationally on radios, newspapers, websites, that there's a bill introduced. Then when that is done, there's a window period that is allocated for people to make written submissions on the proposed legislation. Generally, it's about 45 days to about 2 months where the public is made aware. Most of the time, they will not be seeing that bill for the first time because it will have come from the executive. So they will roughly have an idea what is expected. Others will not really be aware of what. So then there will be that time we advertise, then people start reading through it and consulting in their constituencies, whether it's NGOs, whether it's academic space, whether it's other legs of Parliament, because there's also other neighboring parliaments around the region that are also taking cue from what we are doing to prepare themselves, because as we all know, climate change requires joint effort. So that they are not also left behind. It's some it becomes more of a template. It's what is expected of parliamentarians. Then we go all the way. When that, since we're at the tail end of COVID, physical meetings were still restricted, so we started doing the online meetings to try and comply with that part of making it meaningful. We do understand that online meetings exclude some groups that do not have access to some of these means of communication.
It's about finding a balance, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a tough one, an expensive one. So we then had to consult online through conducting workshops as well, to ensure that both the parliamentarians as well as the other members of the public, because sometimes there's misunderstanding of what the intentions are of certain clauses, and there are also different interest groups that hold opposing views. So those workshops, they help us to bring some kind of a uniform understanding across the board. Then we conducted those ones, and then we had to move to the stage where we had to receive those public inputs, written ones, which mostly were from the online media.
I wanted to ask you about that, about how do you make available the input from the public to the members of the committee? You know, what do you think works best? What's most effective in terms of bringing, because obviously you're collecting their huge range of views from very different types of audiences and with very different purposes. How do you translate all of that and communicate that to the members in the committee?
It's a complicated process, as you can imagine, when you receive 13,000 written submissions. So some of them, it's not just a simple submission. Some of them are more like a mini thesis. And depending on, others are really passionate about what is happening. So they pour their effort there. So it had to take, we had to run the process parallel from the limited human resource that we have. One was to I think we made a mistake initially because the submissions were sent via an email to an email address. So it meant that processing that had to be done manually, like the capturing
Oh my
and reading
goodness.
and
That's a lot of
grouping.
work. Yes.
Yeah, but we learned from that. So now we are using online forms so that at least you get some preliminary analysis of the data. But we have to process it in thematic areas because maybe your interest is on mitigation, other people's interest is on adaptation, other people's interest is on law enforcement, others on penalties and all that. So we grouped the information into thematic areas. And then from those thematic areas, we were then able to also make a follow-up with some of those ones that made the submissions to ensure that we are understanding what they mean by certain inputs that they made there. And
so do you go back, sorry to interrupt, but do you go back to people who submitted or made submissions to clarify what they meant? So what you're saying?
Yes, we did go back to some because the input is valuable, irrespective of how complicated it may seem. And we are also trying to avoid a situation where we misunderstand what they mean. Because sometimes you find that there's a group that is writing or making the input, and at the tail end, some of the things are not really what maybe they meant. So we had online meetings with them that were open to the public. We invited, I think about just more than 50 of them. They came to the committee to make presentations based on their submissions. And then they also got an opportunity to explain what they meant and what they are proposing, because sometimes when documents are a little bit too long, sometimes it becomes difficult to pinpoint what exactly do they want included or removed from this clause. So then it becomes a little bit easier. So unfortunately, it also makes the work a little bit more, because on one side, you have to look at their elaborate submission and also their shortened version or simplified version, and among the other 13,000. But then we used a script to run through the other submissions, so that because it's not really practical, we
sort of more automated methods.
Finished processing, so that it helped us pull together, which is also another point. Possibly in the future, we'll be using AI to distill the information so that it's easy to present to parliamentarians to use it. So we had then to package it in usable formats, although the documents initially were very long. We've had a couple of seminars in this series about how to use automated methods to try to deal with very large submissions, and you can definitely do a lot in that area. Can I just finish before passing on to Temitayo and Omomayowa? Can I just ask whether the committee engages with the public on a climate change issues on ongoing basis? It's something like continuing basis, or is it around specific bills around the legislative process? The committee is involved in various areas, not just the bill, but since it's an environment portfolio, so there are different areas of the sector that they are involved in. In other areas, they are focusing more on the awareness side, whether it's wildlife crimes, whether it's pollution. Sometimes they have the outreach programs where they go out to clean maybe a stream, and then they all invite members of the public or local leaders that become part of the cleanup, whether it's a beach cleanup or some of the rivers, also to raise awareness. So with climate change, what they do is that others are from disaster-prone areas. So it comes almost naturally that when there's a disaster, they have to be there, hands-on, be it part of their ongoing programs at that constituency or as part of a coordinated effort from the committee level. But in general, members are involved on the ground in terms of matters that relate to the environment portfolio, which includes climate change, because some of these areas there's disaster recovery plans that have to be actioned and put in place before other areas, because the level of risk differs. So you find that in other areas they're a bit ahead than in other areas.
So it's very active, really. Yes, there's lots of different types of activities, not just around the legislative process, but also in terms of outreach and raising awareness of climate change issues. That's really interesting. And I suggest we go to the case study now, if that's okay. And then after the case study, there might be more questions, and you might want to come back also to add a few things, reactions to the presentation. If you do, just raise your hand at a time, and then I'll bring you in, if that's okay. Nhlanhla.
Right, yeah.
Is that okay?
No problem.
And I can see we have a raised hand already for question from Mr. Saidov, but I suggest we do that after the case study, if that's okay. So without further ado, then we're going to turn to Temitayo Odeyemi now, who's going to give us more details of some of what Nhlanhla had already mentioned for the case of South Africa, but we'll see it now in the presentation as the authors of the case studies by Temitayo Odeyemi and Omomayowa Abati. So Temitayo, do you want to share your screen and start your presentation?
Yes, thank you so much, Christina. Just about, no. I hope you can see my screen now.
Great, it's on the first slide. That's it, looks great, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much once again. And the presentation we are making is a summary of the research we did on behalf of the Inter-Parliamentary Union to explore how the Parliament of the Republic of South Africa has conducted its public engagement on the issue of the country's climate change bill. And I should say that our own presentation is focused on the process within the National Assembly, yes, as against what is currently ongoing in the National Council of Provinces. And the content of our presentation following this introduction, we look at the political and procedural context of South Africa, the country's public participation model, which has been very important for how public engagement takes place, and then the breaking down of what actually took place in terms of the community engagement, that's the field hearings, and the hearings that took place within the premises of the institution itself, the dimension of translating engagement into public trust, the role of a civil society organization, which has been quite important also for the process, and then conclude with lessons that other parliaments could draw on. So the broad objective is to look at the diverse roles of various actors, including the institution itself, society organizations, community leaders, and the public in coming up with a citizen-centric climate change law for South Africa. To be very sure, South Africa has been very vibrant in issues of climate change across the world, but then up until now, the country does not yet have a definite climate change law, and that is the process that is currently ongoing. First started in 2018 when the department, that's the Department for Environmental Affairs, introduced it for public input. Then up until February 2022, when an updated version was eventually presented in Parliament. And then to understand the context of South Africa, which is very key to how this engagement takes place, a constitutional democracy, with official languages, which is also very important for how engagement takes place. 2 chambers of Parliament, the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces, and then 9 provinces. Okay, and the kind of governance structure that South Africa runs means that these provinces should also have input into how legislations are passed. So we have this figure that also presents a broad picture of how engagement takes place. South Africa is one of the countries in the world where the Constitution explicitly says that Parliament must engage in its core business. And a way that has happened is that a sort of collaboration between the national parliament and the 9 provincial parliament is what we have as the legislative sector public participation framework, which is some sort of intergovernmental collaboration, the level of parliament, where they share best practices, where there's some kind of peer review. So each parliament at different levels then finds a way to domesticate sort of this particular framework in its own functioning. And for the national parliament, there's a public participation model with which the institution tries to narrow down some of the provision of the larger legislative sector public participation framework. And part of the provisions of this public participation model is the supporting structures and internal arrangements that the Parliament of South Africa uses for public engagement. There is a parliamentary constituency office, there's a parliamentary democracy office, which is very crucial, especially to field hearings, that's the community hearings as applicable in the context of the climate change law. And there is also the parliamentary education office. These key structures are very important to how public engagement takes place for legislation in South Africa. And there are different ways that the practicalities of engagement actually happens. There is the sectoral engagement. There is what they call taking parliament to the people. And of course, resources are there, human and financial resources there to try and push this particular process. And then the South African parliament is one parliament that is very heavy on the use of diverse tools to reach different segments of society in terms of sourcing inputs to their various businesses, the business of parliament, social media, leaflets, traditional media, newspaper publication, SMS platforms, as in the case of the climate change bill. The committee actually created a WhatsApp group that featured various communities that they were going to visit. So there was a sort of way that they sort of put the information across so that the members of the public they're engaging with would then have that kind of prior knowledge of what is to take place. And then in terms of the breakdown of this public participation model, 4 key components are quite key at different levels. There is the aspect of information through which the institution disseminates information about its various legislation. And in the case of the climate change bill, various avenues were used to communicate the provisions of this bill in its original draft to stakeholders, including civil society actors, experts, and everyday citizens. And then the consultation aspect was providing the enablement, the platform for people to have input in sort of top-down approach in which Parliament was trying to get people to put in their contributions. The level of involvement was featured something that is more of a much more balanced power relation mechanism in which you have heavy involvement of civil society actors who have been very crucial in connecting the institution to everyday citizens. And then the feedback mechanism is the one that where they then make sure that the input that they get from the public, they find a way to communicate final decisions back to the public. This entire process makes up the public participation model for South Africa, and it is something that has been quite very evident in the processing of this climate change bill. And so I would hand over to Omomayowa to take charge of the findings dimension of the presentation, but then to mention that the data that we present here, we sourced through interviews with key actors, including parliamentary actors as well as civil society actors, and observation of some of these field hearings that took place in the community. Over to Omomayowa.
Thank you, Temitayo. Just like Temitayo had properly introduced, in the case of the climate change bill, we saw the PPM model clearly implemented. I mean, we had the parliaments use the website to publish the original bill in its complete form. And there was this periodic media statements where the parliament was always informing as to what the stage of the bill was, what the progress on the bill was, what meetings have taken place, what calls need to happen, and all of that. So we saw an heavy involvement of digital media through the website and also the social media. There were a lot of live streaming events, just like the representative from the parliament also mentioned. Some of these processes started just around COVID. So it was very important to use a lot of digital tools. There was a lot of live streaming of the events, of committee meetings, of the hearings as well. Some of the public hearings were, live streamed and all that. And we also saw that detailed activities of the bill were always put up on social media. Odeyemi already mentioned how WhatsApp groups were created, with PCO members in each of those groups, bringing in community members from different communities that the parliament was going to visit for public field hearings, and then using those platforms to engage the people in readiness for the visits. And some of those platforms are often also used, to kind of notify the public in terms of what logistics arrangements the parliament has in terms of transportation arrangements and all of that. And we found those very interesting, really. And when it came to the level of consulting the public, a lot of it has already been mentioned, an overwhelming written submission of over 13,135. We saw that as quite overwhelming, and which was very interesting, which kind of made us realize how much of the public can be very active, and the necessity of the public being very active. Because one of the things that the South African model kind of gave us, or kind of made us see, is while the Constitution institutionalizes public participation, it is not enough for that institutionalization from the Constitution. It's also important that the public is active. And we saw that with the written submissions and the oral submissions, that took place in the South African case. And still at the level of consultation, the parliament also then went into the communities, 27 in-person hearings in several communities across all the 9 provinces. That was quite commendable. And that happened between February and July 2023. And at each of these hearings, you find copies of summarized bills. So the full length of the bill is summarized into copies that are translated into other languages. And just like Odeyemi had introduced, South Africa has 11 official languages. That means every community you get to, you have about 3 or 4 official languages in operation. So it was very important to have not just interpreters who are standing by to interpret, but you also have the summarized versions of the bill in other languages, which we saw as something very important. Even though, as I will come to say, some of these were also pinpointed by members of the public to say, why don't we have these bills, the full version of it, the translation in full version, instead of just the summarized version, which is something that I think the parliament will take on in subsequent field hearings. One of the things that was very important as well was also finding sign language interpreters at the public hearings. It was something of a great commendable sight to see that there were sign language interpreters present and that showed the level of inclusion that the parliament was willing to go to make sure that as many people from disadvantaged communities can at least participate in these consultations. And then in terms of involving the public, we saw a very active, civil society sector. South Africa is quite known for its active civil society sector. But then in this climate change bill, we saw a very heavily active civil society sector. For already, we know climate change has environmental dimensions, has health dimensions. So it was very important for the parliament to involve the civil society groups, because their expertise were important. And just like Mr. Ginindza mentioned, these civil society groups were actually invited for hearings. After submitting several written submissions, they also came to the parliament and gave hearings. And beyond that as well, the civil society groups were also very heavily invested in helping the parliament to publicize the information about the bill, educate the public, and as well organize the public and mobilize the public to these hearings. For example, the logistics arrangement that the parliament put in place, some of these things were implemented through the civil society groups who reached out to the communities and told them that, okay, there's this opportunity, we will get in touch with the parliament, buses will be made available, and you can be part of it. And we saw, and that kind of improved the extent to which the public participated in the hearings. And then
got 2 minutes now, Omomayowa, just to say.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
And on the side of the Parliament, we saw that when the hearings were over and the submissions were done, Parliament presented a very consolidated report. And that was something that was even very helpful for us as researchers as well. The report was clearly consolidated. It highlighted the inputs from the public, the proposed changes that the Parliament was willing to make, the additions they were willing to add, and they also still got back to the people the committees, where the committee was listening to, taking these considerations, was also an open platform. The committee meetings were open for people to participate in their meetings, which was something that we found very interesting. Because of time, I will just keep the other, I will just jump to the highlights of the inputs. And one of the things that we saw from the inputs was that a lot of recommendations were made from the public. One of it was important to involve other key actors like the youth, persons with disability, and local municipality actors as well, like the chieftains at the local level, even though they were already part of the public hearings, but the public still wanted more of those people to be involved. And one thing was also, there were issues around language sensitivity of the bill in terms of how inclusive the language was. And there was also recommendations concerning climate awareness introduced into school curricula as a way to start to educate the people from a very early age. And we felt that was something that was very commendable. And another thing that was also important in terms of inclusivity of the bill was also the public recommending to the Parliament to make the bill available in Braille copies, which was something that we found very interesting. And like I mentioned earlier, the full translation of the bill. I would leave the floor for Odeyemi to just round up for us, basically. Thank you. We will take everything in questions.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Temitayo. Do you want to just finish?
All right, yes. In conclusion, the key point that we thought other parliaments could draw from the South African case, the fact that institutionalization is very important to public engagement, not just in terms of climate change, but in terms of general legislation. South Africa already has a structured public engagement mechanism in place. So the climate change law only found its way to fit into that process. And that strengthened the process in a lot of ways. Then the role of civil society is also very key, considering the disconnect between the institution and the wider public. And then there is that need to continuously mobilize the people through massive education mechanisms to ensure that they develop some interest in the business of parliament. And more importantly, when inputs come in, there is a key dimension of making sure that the feedback loop is very much complete by getting back to the people again after the decisions are made. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Temitayo and Omomayowa. That was really, really interesting. And for anyone who wants to know more or clarify any points, if you go to the chat, the links to the case studies were posted in the chat just a few minutes ago, so you can go in there and read more of that. Can you stop sharing the screen now, Temitayo, please? And we've heard about the case of Parliament of South Africa, how institutionalized public engagement is, and this is such a clear example, so interesting. And I have lots of questions to ask you, but I'm going to ask our audience to ask questions now. Can we highlight maybe the three speakers and myself, Mr. Ginindza, Omomayowa, and Temitayo, while we do questions, if that's okay? And Nhlanhla, Ginindza, if you want to add anything to what was said, just click on raise your hand and I'll call you in. But for now, I've got a question from Ahmal Saidov. If you wanted to ask your question, please.
Thank you so much, Honorable Moderator and Chief Chair of International Network for Parliamentary Engagement, Professor Christina Letton-Bordiera. Thank you so much. And thank you for me. It's very interesting, the speaks of our speakers. Thank you so much. It's very interesting, the model of your South African parliaments. I want a few words about Uzbek model of this subject. A few words. We have also several directions in this question. First, we have the legislative basis of public engagement, the parliamentary. The second, institutional basis. We established some of parliamentary organs for public engagement. Third, this educational basis. More important, this is important for our parliaments and public also. Fourth, the monitoring basis. It's on this. And the second, the public basis or the participation in this question, civil society institutions. This is important. And lastly, this international basis of public engagement in the activity of parliament. These are main 6 dimensions of the Uzbek model public engagement in the parliamentary audience. I thank many thanks IPU and
thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That's great to hear. Maybe we should do a seminar on the Uzbek parliament one day. We'll come back. We'll come back to you.
Madam Moderator, I sent my fully text of my intervention for your attention. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Nimish Kumar, do you want to come in now and ask your question?
Thank you, Christina. Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for organizing this very enriching webinar. My question is to the honorable officials of African Parliament. Is this? You mentioned about the committee hearing about the climate change. I just would like to know one thing, that the committee was the temporary parliamentary committee or it wasn't a standing parliamentary committee? Because when it's a standing parliamentary committee, it shows that the parliament, the certain parliament is committed for a long time solution for that. My second, along with that, I just wanted to know that what was the composition of that committee? Is that committee have the honorable member of parliaments from all the parties or from the treasury bench only? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll collect another question if that's okay, and then I'll come to, I think I'll come to Mr. Ginindza if that's okay, Ginindza, to answer these questions about the composition. So Ali Imran, do you want to ask your question or your comments, please?
Thank you very much, Christina. Thank you very much, IPU, for organizing this very important seminar. I think no one can deny the importance of public engagement in parliamentary work on climate change, and I would like to appreciate South Africa case study in that regard. My question is that since many countries, including Pakistan, have their legislations on climate change for almost 3 decades, how do, I'm totally in favor of having a lot of public participation in terms of improving the quality of legislations and having public participation at the time of developing legislations. But at the same time, my question is that how do the other parliamentary models view about the implementation of those legislations, and how do they view the public participation in other areas of parliamentary work, which includes accountability, which includes allocation of resources or budgeting for, and most importantly, the post-legislative scrutiny, because that's one area, since many countries have legislations in place, but they are like forgotten. So no matter what the quality of legislation is, if the resources are not there, if the implementation is not there, if parliaments are not there to check whether those are being or not. So how do the panelists view that how important is the public engagement in other parts of parliamentary work in addition to this improving the quality of legislation? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very important point in terms of implementation and monitoring of legislation. Thank you. We've got lots of hands, so I'm going to carry on if that's okay, because we still have a case study to cover in the seminar. So I'll still hear from Rodolfo and then from Samuel, if that's okay. So Rodolfo, calling in from Brazil.
Hello, Christina. Thank you very much. And hello, colleagues. I would like to know what ways were available for the citizens to send their inputs. How were the MPs able to manage all the inputs they got from the public? And last but not least, was there any process to make the handling of that great deal of information processed easier? Or is it any process to make it easier for the MPs to handle all the information? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rodolfo. We know Brazil is an expert at doing that. Samuel Jose, I don't know if I'm saying Samuel Jose.
Yes, true. Thank you very much. Thank you to Mr. Ginindza. Apologies if I spell your name wrong, for the sharing. My name is Samuel Jose. I'm from Indonesia. As also, someone who's working on youth and climate policy advocacy, I would like to ask, maybe, what are the challenges of South Africa in implementing regulations that allow, civil society to have a dialogue on the table? And second, is there any concrete approach to achieve intergenerational equity on that matter? Because I believe after COP28 to COP29, what we need to learn also about these keywords that are repeatedly said by the civil society representative and delegates. And lastly, before I conclude, I would like to also state in here that maybe in terms of financing loss and damage and other technical issues that are, very difficult to understand by the public, maybe parliaments need to revisit their approach and implement a much more bottom-up rather than a top-down view on this regard to make sure that everyone understands the legislation and how those legislation can help them, what are the challenges, and let's be transparent on what are the roadmap for our sustainable future. So I think that's all. Thank you very much to IPU, and great job, Ms. Christina, for moderating this topic, wonderful and substantive session. And thank you to Ms.
Thank you very much. I can't guarantee we'll address all those questions, but we'll try. Now, final question before we move on for quick answers. So Mohammed Ali from the Shura Council from Bahrain.
Hello, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much for organizing this important gathering or seminar. I'd like to comment that the public participation or what's called parliamentary engagement is a very important tool to know the views of the public. And of course, it's very important to draft any regulation or legislation in this regard, especially if you need to know the quantity or the quality of loss and damage of the climate change in different areas.
Yeah.
Of course, there are two different methods of knowing the public views. There are structural and non-structural methodologies to know their views, depend and different from one society to another. It's very important to bring the different kind of NGOs on board, and you can, of course, know their activities and involvement in the loss and damage of climate change happening in different areas of the region. So at the end, it is very essential and very important tool before doing or drafting any legislation regarding climate change.
Thank you very much for input. Thank you. Definitely. Thanks. We have a lot of questions and a lot of passion on the topic. I'm going to ask each of our speakers to come in and comment really briefly, and some of the answers I think might be able to put in the chat. So Mr. Ginindza, I don't know if you wanted to answer some of these questions. I think maybe if you could just say about the challenge of dealing with the very high volume of submissions, the question from Brazil. So could people, I think you did say that people could send written submissions, but could you say a little bit more about that and the challenge, but really briefly, because we really do need to move on.
Yes, Christine, I think there was quite a number of questions.
Yes.
I think I will just try to limit to the ones that are straightforward. Maybe starting with Nimish. The committees are permanent committees, and they are made of permanent members from multi-party delegation. So whether the work is done in Parliament or outside the parliamentary precinct, it's up to those political parties according to the election results. That's how things are composed in terms of the numbers that will sit for each political party. So, but it's representative in terms of its composition. And then Ali, the resource allocation, particularly on oversight work, it's getting a little bit tricky because there's multiple legislation that Parliament has to ensure that they are financed, and a lot of them, oh, sorry, I forgot that there's also the language, guys. Christine, this thing is tricky. Okay, but the resources that are available have to be spread thinly across the different needs that are there. So we find that in some areas there are loopholes in terms of oversight or implementation, as well as follow-ups, because sometimes there's more follow-ups that are needed in one area than the other. So yeah, it's a tricky because there are also other competing needs from the national budget, let alone just from Parliament. It's a balancing act.
Thank you.
And in terms of the challenges in terms of processing the volume of input, it's really difficult to produce that, because during that time we had one colleague going on retirement, and then we had the other colleague suffering from cancer, I think stage 4. So that extremely affected our capacity. So we had to pull in also the capacity from other committees that are doing something slightly related to this, because we needed to process all the information, so that should it happen that one day we are taken to court on the process itself, we have the paper trail and the evidence to demonstrate in court that we indeed did a thorough and meaningful consultation. So we have everything that was submitted, archived or stored in parliamentary databases. And yeah, it took a lot of time because we had to screen the information first, because others, it had nothing to do with the bill. Then you had others that did multiple submissions. This day is submitting on this, and the next day is submitting on that, the other day. So you find that some of the people had maybe about 5 or 6 inputs that you can easily assume that it's resubmitting the same thing.
Yes.
But to avoid those assumptions, had to go through them. Then you realize that maybe they got other ideas afterwards to add on that. So yeah, it's an involved process. It's really time consuming because we did not really have the break that others enjoyed, because we had to work through, and there was that pressure that we needed to also allow sufficient time to the NCOP to process the legislation without pressurizing them by giving them limited time. I think I will pause there, but maybe they can, there's also the other question on education and awareness. I think we covered that one when we were doing the presentation. But education and awareness is the backbone of meaningful participation in any piece of a legislative process.
Yeah, which is something you've tried to do within the committee. And there was a question also about civil society and regulation. I don't know if you had any insights onto that too, because Omomayowa and Temitayo have told me secretly that you're the expert, so you're the one answering all these questions. So do you have any insights in terms of civil society?
The civil societies are our partners, because we're not able to be ears and eyes everywhere.
That's
so
brilliant,
we heavily rely on them. So which is why in some of these activities, we heavily rely on them, or not really heavily rely. They've somehow accepted that it's their responsibility to be our extended arm in terms of reaching out and in terms of workshops. We conducted lots of workshops, or I conducted lots of workshops with them, so that when they go out there, and it was a bit funny that sometimes we had to be on standby, so that when they conduct something and they ask them difficult questions, then they have to phone back. And but they play a very useful role in terms of strengthening our democracy, not just the consultative process, but democracy in its broad sense, to ensure that there's a two-way communication or two-way flow of information.
Great. Thank you very much. And I think that's one of the reasons why the model in South Africa is so interesting, is that partnership with civil society. I mean, what you said there, civil society are our partners. I don't think you'd say that in many places, you know, from the Parliament perspective. So that's really interesting. We're going to move on to our next case study, which is also really interesting in Latin America. And can I just say that anyone interested on processing mass input from citizens, like we discussed just now, that we did have 2 seminars on that topic, in which actually Rodolfo Vaz was one of our speakers, and Andy from the IPU, he'll post the links to those YouTube of those seminars if you're interested in that topic, so you can follow up there. But I'd like to move on now, if that's okay, to our next case study, because it's really interesting too. And yeah, Andy has posted everything on the chat already for those other seminars we've done on processing mass inputs from citizens. But now we're going to hear from Pablo García Baccino, who's the director of the Latin America Policy Analysis at the Directorio Legislativo, based in Buenos Aires. And he's going to talk about the other case study just published, which is the Escazú Agreement. And it's a slightly different approach to what we've been looking in here. And it's almost more like, you know, what we would like parliaments and governments to do, and the requirements and the framework for that, which I think will be really interesting for many parliaments here too. So Pablo, over to you. And you're going to share the screen too, aren't you? And you're going to do it in Spanish, aren't you? So anyone who wants to hear in English, you will have to click on English at the bottom of your screen. Otherwise, you'll hear beautiful Latin American Spanish being spoken.
Muchas gracias, Cristina. Es un placer. Obviamente, primero quiero agradecer a IPU, ¿no? A la Unión Interparlamentaria, en especial a Andy por el espacio y por el feedback en el proceso de desarrollo de este trabajo, que fue muy, muy interesante. Espero que sea interesante para ustedes también. Primero que nada, les queremos contar a grandes rasgos qué es Directorio Legislativo, ¿no? La organización a la cual estoy representando. Nosotros somos una organización de la sociedad civil que, bueno, impulsamos proyectos de fortalecimiento democrático a lo largo y ancho de todo lo que es la región de América Latina, hace ya 15 años. Nuestro objetivo es precisamente estimular cambios en las prácticas políticas y, por supuesto, también en las normativas que hacen que funcionen nuestros sistemas políticos, tendientes a promover lo que sería, ¿no? la participación ciudadana activa, el acceso a la información pública, para eventualmente poder mejorar la calidad de las normativas, las leyes que enmarcan nuestras sociedades. En ese marco, bueno, por supuesto, uno de los ángulos donde más trabajamos tiene que ver con los poderes legislativos de la región, y en eso se enmarca un poco este estudio de caso que, como mencionaba Cristina, tiene un enfoque algo distinto. Es un enfoque un poco más holístico, más regional, con el objetivo de contar un poco de qué se trata el acuerdo de Escazú, que es un acuerdo internacional muy novedoso en lo que es América Latina, pero también a nivel global. Es un acuerdo que tiene un ángulo y un objetivo muy claro en términos de fortalecer la gobernanza en términos ambientales, en términos de promover mejores normativas para cuidar el medio ambiente, y que es muy novedoso, muy nuevo, y como verán, ha tenido avances concretos en los últimos años. Es un acuerdo que tiene 5 o 6 años, depende cuándo tomemos el plazo de existencia, y por ende, por supuesto, se ha avanzado, pero todavía queda mucho por hacer, y un poco el objetivo de nuestro estudio es contar cómo podríamos lograr que esto efectivamente avance en el corto plazo en la región. Primero que nada, como les mencionábamos, es un acuerdo bastante nuevo. Se firmó en 2018, luego de extensas discusiones. Hubo antecedentes que llevaron a que este proceso de discusión fuera algo más extenso. Tiene sus orígenes en el año 92, en 1992, en una de las convenciones ambientales de Río. A partir de ahí comenzaron a sucederse distintos acercamientos que finalmente llevaron a que este acuerdo se pudiera firmar y que haya entrado en vigencia finalmente en 2021. Su objetivo básico y concreto es promover distintos derechos para las poblaciones de la región en materia de participación, acceso y justicia en materia de legislaciones o regulaciones en términos ambientales. Para eso se consagran esos derechos: el acceso a la información medioambiental, el acceso a la justicia medioambiental. Aquí algo muy novedoso e interesante es que se obliga e insta a los países firmantes y que hayan ratificado el acuerdo a asegurar la protección de los derechos humanos de las personas que promueven acciones para proteger el medio ambiente, algo que es bastante novedoso y necesario en algunos países de la región, donde el activismo social a veces tiene algunos problemas en términos de seguridad y en términos de garantías a sus acciones. Y por supuesto, y el eje central para nosotros, en tanto organización que promueve la participación, lo que tiene que ver con una participación abierta, inclusiva, amplia, en todo lo que tiene que ver con el proceso de construcción de normativas, ya sea legislativas, ejecutivas. El acuerdo principalmente se centra en lo que tiene que ver con el poder ejecutivo, el judicial, y tiene ciertas limitaciones explícitas, aunque no necesariamente implícitas, para el rol del legislativo. Entonces, uno de los objetivos centrales que nosotros tuvimos a lo largo de esta investigación era poder entender de qué manera el poder legislativo puede efectivamente incidir en el proceso de aplicación de este acuerdo. Y diagnosticamos 5 formas, las cuales vamos después a analizar en la práctica si efectivamente se pudieron implementar en 2 casos de estudio, Argentina y Costa Rica. Las 5 formas centrales que tiene el Poder Legislativo o los parlamentos para poder impulsar, ¿no?, la implementación de este acuerdo tienen que ver con la primera, la más básica, la ratificación del acuerdo en los presidencialismos latinoamericanos. Por lo general, los congresos son los que tienen la última palabra en los acuerdos que firma el Poder Ejecutivo. La adaptación de leyes nacionales al nuevo marco legal establecido por el tratado, una vez que el mismo ya haya sido ratificado. Adaptaciones internas en la institucionalidad de los congresos para garantizar, por supuesto, el acceso a la información en términos de debates de distintas leyes, el acceso y la participación a los debates en las comisiones asesoras de cada cámara en cada congreso. Este tipo de adaptaciones que en algunos países de la región están bastante solidificadas, pero en otros todavía distan de ser lo ideales, y por lo general notamos que en el órgano que para nosotros es el central en materia, ¿no?, de participación y de acceso a la información, todavía falta mucho por hacer. El acuerdo también promueve y estimula la construcción de alianzas regionales, alineamientos regionales, compartir buenas prácticas de regulación, buenas prácticas de desarrollo normativo, que entendemos el Congreso puede ser, o los congresos de la región pueden, a través de alianzas interparlamentarias, promover acciones unificadas que hayan funcionado en algunos países y que se puedan adaptar a otros, obviamente aceptando las particularidades de cada lógica nacional, ¿verdad? Y por ende, y otra acción que hemos diagnosticado que el legislativo podría impulsar tiene que ver con las funciones de control y supervisión del Poder Ejecutivo, que es, por lo general, el órgano del Estado que más responsabilidades tiene para la implementación de este acuerdo. En ese marco, nosotros hemos diagnosticado y hemos intentado implementar o analizar si esas 5 acciones o esas 5 formas principales de acción que podría llevar a cabo el Poder Legislativo para garantizar una correcta implementación de Escazú ha sucedido en los 2 casos de estudio que hemos elegido, y hemos intentado explicar por qué en algunos casos sí y en otros casos no, con miras, por supuesto, a sacar conclusiones y aprendizajes que nos permitan pasar a la acción en aquellos países donde todavía hay pasos por dar y en donde ya se haya completado la implementación, bueno, tomar esos ejemplos como referencia. De todos modos, como les mencionábamos, en ningún caso el acuerdo está completamente implementado por una cuestión de que son cambios normativos novedosos que conllevan adaptaciones amplias, complejas, y acá hay un dato importante para América Latina: la agenda ambiental a veces suele quedar postergada ante el impacto o ante el argumento de que avanzar en ciertas agendas ambientales pueden tener un impacto negativo en el desarrollo económico de una región que, como conocemos, tiene ciertos problemas de distribución de la riqueza y de pobreza. Pero entrando particularmente al caso de Argentina, que es el caso que nosotros hemos diagnosticado, ha avanzado bastante más fuerte que algunos otros casos en la región. Es importante mencionar que esto se dio gracias a algunas cuestiones centrales. En primer punto, apoyos amplios y profundos interpartidarios. Argentina es un país donde, a pesar de que en los últimos 4 años hemos tenido dos coaliciones que han tenido dificultades en construir puentes en el Congreso para avanzar en una agenda concreta, lo cual ha conllevado ciertos efectos en materia económica y política, sobre esta temática la ratificación del acuerdo se dio con suma velocidad. Esto se debió a que tanto de un lado como del otro lado del espectro político entendieron la relevancia de avanzar con esta ratificación. Sin embargo, también en ese marco fue muy importante el apoyo de la sociedad civil, se dieron procesos y campañas públicas y también participaciones esporádicas en el Poder Legislativo. Es importante mencionar que la ratificación del Acuerdo de Escazú en Argentina se dio en el marco de la pandemia, por ende los trabajos legislativos tuvieron que adaptarse rápidamente a una lógica de distancia, una lógica de uso de herramientas digitales que complejizó algunas participaciones de otros sectores interesados. Pero en cualquier caso, el apoyo de la sociedad civil y también el apoyo de factores de poder económico, que vamos a ver en otros casos no fueron avales que existieran y por ende fueron una explicación de por qué no avanzó el acuerdo. Bueno, en este caso existieron y permitieron que el texto pudiera ser rápidamente ratificado. Asimismo, en el Poder Ejecutivo y también en el Legislativo comenzaron a proliferar iniciativas, proyectos que intentaban modificar las normas internas para consagrar explícitamente en el andamiaje institucional del país los derechos consagrados en Escazú. Algunos de esos proyectos han logrado comenzar sus debates, pero en el contexto político actual, con un cambio de gobierno y con un poder ejecutivo que ha objetado la relevancia del avance de las agendas ambientales, eso se ha ralentizado y es probable que otro de los aprendizajes que vamos a tomar como conclusión es que cuando los poderes del Estado no están alineados hacia un mismo objetivo, la implementación específica y concreta del acuerdo se ha visto complejizado. Que eso nos permite entrar al caso de Costa Rica. El acuerdo, dicho sea de paso, toma el nombre de un país, de una ciudad dentro de Costa Rica. Costa Rica fue uno de los principales promotores de la firma, de la negociación de este acuerdo. Sin embargo, cuando efectivamente fue firmado y tocó el turno de ratificarlo en la asamblea del país, en el poder legislativo del país, se dio un proceso que complejizó, que es precisamente la falta de construcción de apoyos amplios, no solo partidarios, sino también de los distintos factores de poder estatales y de los factores de poder de la sociedad civil y del sector privado. Efectivamente, en un primer instante, Costa Rica logró avanzar, estuvo muy cerca de ratificar el acuerdo. Sin embargo, el Poder Judicial identificó que el proceso legislativo para su ratificación no había sido conforme a derecho, no se había incluido las opiniones del Poder Judicial en el proceso de ratificación, y al mismo tiempo, mientras el Poder Judicial retrotraía el debate a primeras instancias, empezaron a aparecer opiniones encontradas de parte de distintos factores y cámaras empresariales de mucha relevancia en el país, lo cual restó poder y apoyos a la iniciativa. Las oposiciones políticas de ese momento, los partidos como el Partido de Unión Social Cristiana y el Partido de la Liberación Nacional, se dieron cuenta que no estaban de acuerdo con el fondo de la cuestión y el proyecto no pudo avanzar. Y finalmente, poco tiempo después, con un cambio de gobierno, con la llegada del gobierno actual de Rodrigo Chávez, esta temática dejó de ser una prioridad también para el Poder Ejecutivo, dinamitando el último bastión de apoyo político y de acción política que tenía este acuerdo en ese país. Previo al cambio de gobierno, para el gobierno de Alvarado, que era el que había impulsado la firma, esto era una prioridad máxima. Sin embargo, con la llegada de Chávez, eso dejó de serlo. Entonces, vemos, y en base a estos estudios, que son, por supuesto, muy a grandes rasgos, podríamos ir mucho más profundo, pero tampoco tenemos el tiempo y el espacio como para hacerlo, pero bueno, está el paper para que lo puedan leer. Hay algunas lecciones clave a observar con esta lógica y este objetivo a futuro de seguir trabajando por una correcta implementación de este acuerdo que, como mencionábamos, está en proceso y está dando sus primeros pasos. En primer punto, necesitamos y es imprescindible construir un amplio apoyo político multipartidario. Oficialismos, oposiciones, partidos independientes, es importante construir consensos en torno a la pertinencia de tener este instrumento y de garantizar participación para toda la sociedad en temáticas que en última instancia nos afectan a todos, como es participar en no sé, la concesión de una explotación offshore de petróleo o distintas cuestiones. La polarización complica el avance, complica la inexistencia de puentes, complejiza el avance de estas temáticas o depende o hace que dependa de circunstancias coyunturales donde haya un gobierno que realmente tenga una mayoría propia, lo cual establece ciertas incógnitas.
Pablo.
Perfecto. Establece ciertas incógnitas a futuro en materia de si cambia el balance político, el nuevo gobierno no querrá precisamente ir en contra de estos acuerdos. Entonces, por eso es importante una base bien sólida de apoyos políticos. Por otro lado, también un avance y una coordinación de todos los poderes del Estado. Es un acuerdo y es un tratado que requiere que tanto el Poder Judicial, el Poder Ejecutivo y el Poder Legislativo estén alineados, no solo para ratificarlo, sino también para implementarlo y asegurar su correcta aplicación en el país. También en América Latina tenemos países federales, unitarios, entender la estructura institucional, entender qué apoyos necesitamos en cada Cámara del Congreso para su implementación, para su ratificación, es importante. Hay cámaras legislativas en América Latina que representan a los estados, cada estado puede tener una lógica más cercana o lejana al extractivismo o a un desarrollo en base a recursos naturales y por ende entender que este acuerdo no es necesariamente nocivo es imprescindible. Y por último, también importante tener en cuenta que la sociedad civil, pero también el sector privado, y esto es algo que desde el Directorio Legislativo impulsamos mucho, es importante que participen en todos los espacios, que todos estén alineados en un gran acuerdo, porque solo así se pueden construir los apoyos amplios y correctos para que esto efectivamente se pueda implementar. Así que a grandes rasgos esas son las conclusiones y bueno, les agradecemos mucho por el espacio.
Thank you so much, Pablo. That was so interesting. And for anyone who didn't notice, there's actually a link in the chat. Maybe you could post it again, Andy, if you don't mind, a link to Pablo's slides in English, if anyone would like to save those, have a look at those. And that complemented really well our first case study, didn't it? Because it sort of went at a higher level and it called the importance for not just having those institutional structures like there is in South Africa very clearly. You reinforce the importance of working together with civil society and how important that is, but also that political will and having that wide political will and political support across parties, and the danger that when that doesn't happen and there's a change in government, then policies are not developed and all that work goes through. So that was really, really interesting. So we have some time now for more questions. If anyone would like to come in, I would really like to encourage any women participants because we've had only speakers and questions from men so far. So I would really love to hear some female voices. If there's anyone in there who would like to ask some questions, please just click on raise your hand and I'll call you in. And wonderful, we have a hand up already. So if you want to come in, we don't have a lot of time for questions, so please do click on raise your hand if you want to ask a question. So can we go to Meera, please? And apologies if I didn't say your name properly.
Good evening or good morning, according to whatever time zone you're in. Thank you for this very insightful exchange. I'm a parliamentarian from Egypt, and I have introduced the first ever legislation to the Egyptian legislative framework about adaptation to climate change and how we could combat this. So I wanted to share here the experience of how we can actually join the efforts with a very important factor in doing a perfect legislation, which is academia too. So actually, from my experience, I have went to the departments at 3 different universities where they have done some research, and we tried through an NGO which actually tackles to fill the gap between the legislators and the civil society, to bring the civil society along with the legislators and the experts from the universities. It was a big event. There were more than 70 legislators from both chambers, the the House and the Senate came together, and it was a workshop over several days where we actually got ideas to tackle climate change from too many aspects, which definitely affected the oversight tools and also affected the interventions of the legislators to this. So what I wanted to just highlight is also sometimes bringing the knowledge to the MPs, because how little is their time, how very much like they need precise information, recommendations to jump in, and this definitely affect their oversight and their legislative. So here we have also as MPs to connect the dots. Connecting the dots sometimes makes it like very, very much more effective.
Thank you very much. And again, that reinforces the point about coordination, doesn't it, and partnership. That's so it's not just civil society and NGOs, but also universities, where there's a lot of research and a lot of expertise that members and parliaments can benefit from when it comes to developing policy and monitoring policy. Thank you very much for sharing your experiences. And Nimish Kumar, did you have another question? And anyone else, can you click on raise your hand? Again, particularly if you're a woman, I would really like to have more female voices in this seminar. Nimish Kumar.
Thank you. Thank you, Krishna. Thank you very much. And thank you, Andy and Pablo, because Pablo, we and DL, for some of the previous webinar, we discussed these things, and particular this presentations highlight those concerns we discussed before, that there is a need to sensitize our honorable member of parliament about this issue. He mentioned that they prefer the economic development versus the climate crisis. So this is the time when we have to make more and involve more and more honorable member of parliamentarians. There are 46,000 member of parliaments from our 193 parliaments have. So it's the time when we have to brief them, tell them that's how important this crisis is, because all over the world, the parliamentarians are not really accepting these things, that it's a more danger, it's more important than the economic or some local development. So that's my point. How we going to do these things to make our parliamentarians more and more aware about this particular issue, the climate change. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anish. Pablo, what do you say to this? How can we make parliamentarians more aware? And I mean, in Directorio Legislativo, you work with a lot of parliaments, don't you? And you work obviously in this area of public participation, transparency. And what would you say works best in terms of getting that information, convincing and getting members on board, particularly with, you know, such a challenge as an issue that affects us all globally?
Sí, decididamente es un tema muy importante y es un desafío en América Latina. Decididamente la participación, bueno, la acción de la sociedad civil, explicar, ¿no?, los impactos, entender la lógica de quizás hoy priorizamos cierta, digamos, bonanza económica, pero no entendemos que esta bonanza económica es un problema futuro, y entender esa cuestión, ¿no?, explicarle esa cuestión a la ciudadanía, a los legisladores. Puede ser que esto tenga un impacto, en última instancia, a los legisladores, y ellos necesitan, ¿no?, o aspiran a mantener o lograr continuar representando a la ciudadanía, y por lo general una ciudadanía empobrecida es más difícil que te vuelva a elegir. Pero también es cierto que a largo plazo, si seguimos usando los recursos como se usan en América Latina, en algunos espacios, en algunos países de manera muy irresponsablemente, eventualmente eso no va a seguir funcionando a largo plazo. Entonces es como que hay que sincerar, hay que explicar, hay que acercarse a los parlamentarios y llegar a un buen puerto en explicar estas cuestiones, en priorizar hoy, porque el día de mañana si no va a ser mucho más difícil.
Thank you very much, Pablo. Absolutely spot on. And there's no more time to wait, is there? I keep hearing people will do this whenever, but actually the time is now. as we heard in that video by Meera, also already from the group that supported COP28, the actions should be now and not for a decade to come. And we get into the end of the seminar. Thank you so much for all your participation, all your questions for the speakers. Before I do any my proper thank yous, just to announce our next seminar of the Public Engagement Hub. So the Public Engagement Hub is the seminar we're doing today, co-hosted by the IPU and by IPEN. And the next one will be, I hope I'm getting my date right, I think it's the 11th of March. Yes, you've got the details in the chat, 11th of March, and we'll be looking at a slightly different topic from today, but the use of social media by parliaments and reflections from Brazil. But actually, a lot of what we talked about today is how you disseminate and transmit and share information, which is something we'll talk about again then. So if you'd like to attend that seminar, please click on the link and register for the seminar, because it's only by registration. And you can find more information about the Public Engagement Hub, also links that will appear in the chat, but also more information about IPEN, the International Parliament Engagement Network, if you're interested on a public engagement topic and would like to explore those in more depth. That's what we do in that network. But I come to my thank yous. My thank yous to everyone who attended. We had really good participation today, nearly 100 people participating from all across the world, I think all the way from India to Brazil and many other places in between, so that's wonderful. And thank you very much to our interpreters who do a fantastic job and enable us to offer this to different languages and cope with our speaking very quickly, but they always do a really good job and ensures we can offer this to many people. But finally, our thank yous to our speakers, from the 3 speakers from South Africa and our speaker from Latin America. All 4 speakers were fantastic. So can you please join me in showing your appreciation either by hands or in sign language or virtual clapping, however you wish to do. I'm not bothered as long as you show your appreciation. And that's it from us. And can I ask the speakers to stay on the call so I can say thank you to you properly. But for everyone else is goodbye, good evening, good day, good afternoon, wherever you are. And we hopefully will see you on the 11th of March for our next seminar. Bye-bye.